First, we have China's northeast, and this is characterized by the Loess Plateau, which is a fine yellowish soil type, which is quite fertile, but easily erodible, especially after a long period of time of human activity that has tried to farm this particular region. Moving forward from the North China Plain out of the Loess Plateau and into China's far northeast, where we talk about extractive resources, where this region is successful in terms of oil, natural gas, and more extractive properties like minerals. And so it's found success there through the mining industry and through oil extraction. And we talked about that type of economy through extractive properties before. And then it also leads to a conglomeration of urban area through Beijing and Tianjin. Beijing is the capital of China. It's a metro area of 21 million people, so it's quite large here in China's northeast. It's closely, it's not too far away from the Korean Peninsula. And again, up in this part of the country that we can see, again, this area, this urban area of Beijing is modern infrastructure, high rises, modern buildings, and a high-paced lifestyle. One that we would see sort of like in the west of a more westernized major city is here in this region, as well as these agricultural areas and mining areas like we had just discussed with the North China Plain and that of Loess Plateau. Brings us to central China, which is the Sichuan province and the central and coastal plains. So we know the central and coastal plains obviously dominated by farming activity because these are some of the most fertile soils in the entire region, specifically in the entirety of China. Sichuan province, also known as the Red Basin, due to the red sandstone that underlies that top layer of soil. And so this area kind of comes at a connection. It's 11 million people because we have Shanghai, major city for all of East Asia, all of Asia actually, and actually a major global city located here in central China along the coast. And we talk also about farming here. And so this is this nexus between urban and rural life when we talk about farming and that of the city, as seen here. Again, Three Gorges Dam of the Yangtze River, located here, world's largest dam, major city of Shanghai, and again, a lot of farming still taking place in this region due to its fertile soil. And we talked about this area of central and southern China where they're simply running out of room because there are cities that are expanding into urban sprawl, and there's still farming activity taking place. And so this is sort of contrasting views of found in the same region. Southern China, which brings us into this area of southern China, the southeastern coast. If you remember correctly, this is a humid subtropical area, that monsoon area that does, this area remains quite warm all year round. It also becomes quite wet through the ITCZ and the monsoon season. Macau was a Portuguese holding. Portugal, the country located next to Spain in southwestern Europe, used to hold on to this area for a trading post in East Asia. Hong Kong, until 1997, had partial control of Hong Kong until now it became more control to the Chinese, a little bit of a freer area, democratically and economically speaking, than the rest of mainland China. And again, an area that can be characterized by its nature, its flora and fauna. Historically speaking, this is the large range of what was the giant panda, what we would say maybe is the mascot of China, or at least we would say that. And I think they would probably agree. They seem to love the panda. But it's sort of now reserved to just about 40 reserves and preserves for the giant panda now in this area, as again, urban sprawl and population being drawn to this area because of its climate and major coastal cities. Seen here, again, the mixture between just these major urban areas and still some traditional farming and sort of the natural animals and wildlife that do have control of this area as well in the forested areas that still do exist in the region. The far north and west China, we talked about Xinjiang and the Uyghur people and the Kazakhs. And so we know that these are an ethnic and religious minority that are in a semi-autonomous area that are in the far north and western part of China. We know this is Kazakhstan, and the Stan countries, the land of the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs and the like. And so Kazakhs and Uyghur people, again, Muslim faith, and so we have worshippers of Islam and a small minority, so religious and cultural ethnic minority that have been attempted to be assimilated. The Han Chinese have been sent there through a Go West policy to try to break that cultural niche that has been taking place there for time. It's erupted in violence over periods of time through terrorist activity because of prejudices against Islam that takes place to try to break up this area. And so it's an ongoing problem that the Beijing central government fights with the Xinjiang, the more local government and the local people there. We then talk about the plateau of Tibet, north of the Himalayan mountains, the plateau of Tibet, that highland area. We know that that area is, again, another area of a cultural and religious minority of the Tibetan people that, again, have some freedom. But this area of Xinjiang, mostly we would tie it in with Kazakhstan and Mongolia. They have their collapsible homes that are called yurts. They look pretty cool. And it forms from that nomadic lifestyle that they once had. Again, this area relied on grazing of animals, yaks, sheep, goats, that they rely on for a variety of things, for their wool, for their milk and other products, and in some cases for their skin, for, historically speaking, more so for the lining of those yurts and things, although come a long way in terms of the production of those. But again, something that we would see here with a more traditional, a person in more traditional clothing. Some of the Uyghur people here out in China's far northwest, and they're a yak you can see there. And we'll talk about Mongolia and sort of tie all that together. When we talk about the communist era, again, we moved away from communism in Mongolia, from the central planning that comes from the post-communist era as it's moved. Gender roles in Mongolia have been fluctuating, and we'll talk about Mongolia. We remember the Mongols perhaps from even the 1200s, when we know Genghis Khan, perhaps is a familiar name, and then a descendant of Kublai Khan. Again, two people. The entire country of Mongolia, only 3 million people. So we've talked about specific provinces and even metro areas in China of 23 million people or more, 38 million people in that area, the Tokyo area of Japan, not China, but Japan. But again, only 3 million people in this entire country, largely because we have the Gobi Desert and other inhospitable areas, and we have a nomadic people and a not very urban type of lifestyle. Again, historically a nomadic people. But historically, women had equal status to men in Mongolia, so the gender roles were quite favorable for women. To this day, they still have a life expectancy about 8.5 years longer than men, which is quite a profound difference when we look around the world in that. So that's a bit of an outlier and some good information to know. Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, and you can see it's an urban area, although maybe not as dense as we would see with the rest of the region. Here's a traditional yurt that we would find in both Western China and in like the Xinjiang province, and as well as in Mongolia. And you can see sort of the traditional meeting the more modern in there of, actually might be right here. That looks like that building to that. I just noticed that maybe we pulled the image from like that, so pretty interesting. But again, not as densely populated, of course, not a lot of people, 3 million people in Mongolia. But again, relating to Mongolia being in that communist regime like North Korea and China for so many years, and then sort of breaking away and going about it in its own way, with its own local influences. It brings us to Korea, north and south, and they're very different, so they probably shouldn't even share a slide. You may have heard of the Korean War. It followed World War II, and it preceded, so before, a Vietnam War. So we have World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. And at the 48th parallel, we divide the Korean Peninsula between the north and the south. It's become the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which we'll show a picture of. We'll jump around here. The demilitarized zone, where you'll see the difference between the North and South Koreans. And this is an area where there are some meetings that take place, and largely an area of contention between two very different nations, and ones that are quite at odds with each other. Because what we have is we have a democracy, and we have a communist regime, and we have definitely an antagonizer in Kim Jong-un, also known as Little Rocket Man, as if you pay attention to Twitter. And so what we have now, and I guess we would talk about that because it's topical and it's relevant because we're here. We're talking about North and South Korea, and there's been an escalation, and that goes in ebbs and flows. Sometimes there's areas of provocation and not, but we're in a period of heightened contention between the West due to military testing of nuclear weapons that have been taking place in North Korea. And we have Donald Trump engaging in some Twitter battles with Kim Jong-un, the leader of the son of Kim Jong-il, and now who passed away some years ago. And Kim Jong-un, his son, takes over, and known as Little Rocket Man, if you're paying attention on Twitter, but which is, again, just some name calling that's probably not necessary. He refers to Donald Trump as dotard, which is, I think, senile old man. But again, this kind of name calling that's taking place, it's a rise in escalation because of this militarized testing. They're really bullying their neighbors, if you will. Highly don't anticipate, this is just me, I'm not an expert on this because if I was, I'd probably be working somewhere else. But I mean, it's largely understood that this is an area where in order to keep his power, Kim Jong-un, he has to sort of flex the little muscle that he has to continue to boast his power, or his perceived power in his country, to make him look powerful and strong to the rest of the world. So his internal support does not go away, because things are not going well in North Korea. There is starvation, malnutrition, periods of drought, underdevelopment, accounts of cannibalism at times, and again, a very, very disheartening situation that takes place in North Korea and right across when we have defectors that run from North Korea into South Korea and see a flourishing economy that aligns itself with the West, with Japan, Taiwan, the United States, and Europe. And so we have these contrasting political systems and contrasting economies, therefore. The Olympic Games in 2018, the Winter Olympic Games, were held in South Korea. Perhaps you've seen those just a few months ago. But again, we're in a period of heightened contention. Donald Trump has agreed to talk with Kim Jong-un. That seems to perhaps be taking place. We'll have to wait and see. This would be a first in a very long time, relatively unprecedented, and so we'll see what comes of that. In my opinion, this is perceived risk because, again, I think that this is some man-made issues that they're just sort of flexing their muscles to see who thinks who's more powerful. We certainly know that if we would go to war with each other, that it would be quite devastating for both areas because, again, we have such allies in the region in South Korea and Taiwan and Japan, Hawaii and Guam and things like that. And they know that they certainly would be in quite a bit of trouble if they actually carried forward some form of attack, which why a lot of people believe these are somewhat empty threats. But again, just an opinion. You could read about the book and certainly read about these things more on your own, but that's where we are right now. We sort of have some empty threats going back and forth, some name calling and a lot of pettiness, and we'll see where that goes. Japan. So a wide geographic spectrum. We go from Mount Fuji to coastal beaches of Okinawa and other places, and certainly variants of local geography. Challenge of living well on limited resources. They're a major importer of resources, particularly food, because they're, again, an island nation of an archipelago. Honshu is the most densely populated island, with Hokkaido being the least populated of those 5 major islands that we talk about. Japan's culture contrasts, we've discussed just a bit, but that sort of ties into the foreign workers that are sort of starting to supplement the workforce. As we see more and more Japanese retiring and an aging population, About only 1.5% are foreign workers, but largely coming from South Asia and other developing nations like Peru, which is more of an outlier that the book mentions, but mostly from places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka and places like that have come on as foreign workers to fill the gaps in industries that are sort of in the more primary sector, things like agriculture and construction and things like that. Not much agriculture happening there, so more so things like domestic service and construction. Partnership between the United States military and Japan. Mount Fuji, highest point in Japan, and again, one of their bustling cities. Taiwan, and this is last of the regions, again, about 90 to 100 miles off the coast of China. China claims Taiwan. Taiwan wants no part of it. It would be independent. So there are these differences. Taiwan being more of a free market economy, aligning itself with the West, a democracy, where China certainly all not of any of that. And so the relationship is therefore strained. You had a lot of people defecting from China during the period of communism, trying to get onto that island of Taiwan to get away from persecution and communism, the communistic regime. And they played their cards right in the sense. So again, to attract trade and interest and help and support from Europe and the United States and generally the West-speaking, Japan, South Korea, and the West, they really put on a foot of anti-communism, and it attracted then therefore that support and partnership because it was, again, this idea of communism versus capitalism. They reject China and communism, and so therefore they become trading partners of the United States and other democracies around the world. And so it was really good for them economically speaking, hedging their bets, aligning themselves with the West. And you can see here it's off the southeastern coast of China. So we have Japan up here, Korean Peninsula, the Philippines, where we're going to be talking about in Southeast Asia soon, and Southeast Asia here, such as like Vietnam. The future of Taiwan certainly brings it more and more promising from an economic standpoint, as it's a very well-off country in terms of its GDP per capita. 23 million people occupy this small island, like we talked about before, 21.5 million cars on the island, 23 million people. And so its anti-communist stance certainly drew interest from the West during that period of time. And again, just this stark contrast between Taipei, Taiwan, and a large, densely urban and populated city to places like its beautiful coasts in Kettering National Park and southernmost point. And so a lot of the development in urban area is to the north, and a little bit more natural conditions to the south. So that actually wraps up all of East Asia.